Cool. Okay. Well, the main reason I wanted to talk to you was about UK tax, but I forgot how much you knew about Switzerland, so that was quite interesting. Um, yeah, let's talk about the UK then. I'm from Jersey, obviously, and whenever you work in a trust company in Europe, I think it was very hard to not have some structure that was a UK tax planning structure. The UK, I guess there was two things that happened, wasn't it, in the 80s and 90s, was them liberating all the financial markets and London just becoming this massive financial center. And then obviously they created this thing called the non-dom rule, which if I was to simplify it, and you can correct me if I explain this correctly, but the non-dom rule was simply you could earn as much money outside of the UK as you want, and you would not be taxed on that. You'd only be taxed on what you earn in the UK or that you brought into the UK. And for a lot of people around the world, that was a fantastic deal. They could come and live in a place. Okay, the weather's not great, but you can do everything you want there. You can do all the business you want. You can raise money there. You've got great talent. And it was just a great place also that your families didn't mind living in. Wives tended to be happy there as well. They could have a good social life. The kids could be well educated. And so it was just a fantastic deal. And also because of the demand, London then sucked in kind of all the talent from Europe, didn't it? From Spain, Germany, France. So you had all the best of Europe in London. But that's changed, hasn't it? And they put a sort of a fee on that you after a few years you had to pay a certain amount to have that status. Then there was a cap on when it expired. So after, I think it was 18 years, isn't it? The whole effectiveness of it disappeared. But yeah, maybe just can you tell us your views on the non-dom rule? What's happening with it? Is it going to go entirely?
Yes.
Or is it still a good deal for people?
Yeah, well, so the non-dom regime that everyone hears mentioned a lot, it has its origins back in times of empire, and it was a concept that British people had gone off around the world, working in the empire or living in the empire, but still having ties to the UK, maybe still coming back to the UK, and it was just this idea that what money you had outside the UK was not taxed in the UK. It evolved over time so that it became limited to people who were not from the UK originally. If you had a non-UK domicile, if you moved to the UK, you could live in the UK without everything that you have outside the UK in your home country or elsewhere, or immediately becoming within the scope of UK taxation. So so I think that combines with just UK and the London's role as a international centre, again going back to times of empire, but the London in the 70s, 80s, you have a lot of Middle Eastern individuals who've always spent quite a lot of time in London. As you're saying, the financial centre of the City of London, especially in the 80s, absolutely exploded. In terms of relationships with the US, London's the natural go-to place for coming to Europe. Within Europe, it was the financial centre, even surviving the creation of the euro to a large extent. And so, yeah, for a long time, the non-dom regime operated in a pretty straightforward way, and also quite, very undoubtedly extremely beneficial for some people. So, classic cases. You move to the UK. Whatever you earn in the UK, in your job in the UK, or any other income you have within the UK, like rent on property or dividends from a UK company, you pay UK tax on. Anything you have outside the UK or earn outside the UK, you will only pay tax on if you bring that money into the UK to use it, spend it in the UK. Then there were various, the other aspect of that is the inheritance tax. So if you were a non-dom living in the UK, in fact, if you're non-dom living anywhere in the world, but even if you're living in the UK, only your UK assets would be subject to UK inheritance tax, and assets outside the UK would not be subject to inheritance tax. And then with those fundamental rules, there was planning people could do so that certain individuals who were extremely wealthy, they could move to the UK, and if they were careful to not earn anything in the UK and structured their assets outside the UK in a certain way so that they never brought any income or gains into the UK. They just
yes, this is the clean capital, isn't it? The clean capital.
Yeah. So if essentially wealth that you already had before you moved to the UK could in future be brought to the UK without being taxed. So if you could keep that wealth that you already had separate from new income and gains that you earned after you moved to the UK, then you would have this pot of clean capital that you could use to fund your life in the UK. So it was a well-established regime, and always over the years, to some people it has an inherent unfairness. Why are all these? Why are foreigners, and maybe particular rich foreigners, able to come and live in the UK and not pay any taxes, whereas sort of good, honest, hardworking Brits are paying all the tax? So it has an apparent unfairness, which means it's always open to political challenge. But what's tended to happen is that those lobbying on behalf of the non-doms have generally persuaded governments that it's not a good idea to get rid of the regime, and even there's been political compromises where the regime has been limited in various ways, or as you say, I suppose the biggest changes were, firstly, they said that after you've been in the UK for more than 7 years, you have to start paying a charge to access the regime.
It's about £50,000, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after 18, so then they changed it again in 20, or announced in 2015, that after 15 years in the UK, in theory, you no longer not have access to non-dom regime at all. But at the same time, there were even if you've lived in the UK for 15 years, it's not necessarily the end of the story.
If you're structured, you can still drag it out, can't you? If you had a pre-planning structure, yeah. And if the trustees hadn't ballsed that up with the mixing the capital and income gains and the accounting and that sort of thing, right? Or tainting the trust by letting new additions in. I mean, trustees certainly earn their money when they're running one of these trusts, because if they make one mistake, they can ruin the whole tax planning, can't they? But yeah, so where is it now then? Is it still attractive, do you think, or are people still using it, or?
Yeah, I think too much importance can be given to the non-dom regime and whether it continues or not. I mean, I think that the current state of play is that Labour have said that if they win the next election, and it's widely assumed they will win the next election, they are going to get rid of the non-dom regime. That's the headline. Now, in theory, that would mean that everyone who is a UK resident will pay tax on the same basis, which is that you pay UK tax on your worldwide income and gains. We will have there will be the same debate as ever, which is is that actually something that's sensible to be doing for the UK economy? Because are you going to put off dynamic, economically active, talented, wealthy individuals from moving to the UK, which is part and parcel of making the UK a global financial centre, making UK economically successful, and so on. I do think that you need to have some form of entry system, a stepping stone to becoming UK resident, a full UK taxpayer. I think if it is as blunt as you move to the UK and you just, all your worldwide situation automatically becomes within the scope of the UK tax system, that is going to be a disincentive to some people moving to the UK.
Now, yeah, that's a good point, actually. Isn't it? A lot of people want to just dip their toes into a jurisdiction first, don't they? Right, and see.
Yeah, and now there's so much competition. You know, other jurisdictions are offering all their own regimes for new arrivals, whether it's Italy, Portugal, and so on. I mean, probably if you look into the details, you know, lots of places in the world will effectively have special rules that apply to new arrivals or foreigners moving to the country, or ways in which things can be structured. There's a perception issue, and I think that also goes hand in hand with Brexit and political uncertainty in the UK, also geopolitical events like the war in Ukraine. It is in the 90s, 2000s, London was the place to be. People from all around the world were moving to London to live, to work, to invest, to run businesses. Some point following the financial crisis, the run-up to changes to the non-dom rules, run-up to Brexit itself, COVID, political uncertainty since COVID, all those things have completely reversed the momentum in terms of the UK being a go-to jurisdiction for wealthy individuals. Now, some people might say, well, who cares? I would agree that countries of the size of the UK should not be really staking their future or really setting their policies on being a playground for sort of wealthy elite. But it goes far beyond the wealthy elite. I think it's internationally mobile individuals in general. Do they see the UK as being a receptive, friendly place to live, work, do business? When you combine with sort of UK immigration policy and all the rhetoric about immigration, if you go back to Theresa May, she made this statement in one of her speeches about sort of deriding these globally mobile individuals who are citizens of nowhere, and going to this much more populist idea of being a true Brit and fully contributing and so on, and which I think 50% of the population of London were born outside the UK, which is an incredible statistic. Only a very small number, very, very tiny proportion of those would be individuals that would ever seek to avail themselves of the non-dom regime, because the vast majority of people are just normal people living, working in London or studying in London. But I think it's all about how foreigners perceive the UK and whether it's a place that is friendly to them and where they are welcome. And I think in the modern global economy, you do need to be somewhere that is welcoming to people who want to come and work in the UK, because UK desperately needs overseas talent at all kinds of levels of the economy, and also to set up businesses and invest in the UK. So I think with the non-dom, it rather than what I think I would welcome Labour doing if they do win is taking a slight step back and saying, before we decide to hack at the non-dom regime and make some, probably rather than, what's most likely is that instead of just getting rid of the non-dom regime, they will make headline changes to it to apparently make it more restrictive or more expensive.
And quite often, a lot of the time, they just do window dressing, don't they? So they get the headline for the newspapers, and then there's exemptions in the back door that, like with ATED, ATED with the property, and Conservatives clamped down on overseas people holding UK property in trusts, but then there was an exemption if you rented it out, and which most of them did, and that never made the front page of the papers. So I think sometimes the politicians sometimes understand what you and I are talking about better than we give them credit for. I think sometimes they know that they've got to sort of manage the media, and then when you see the detail, it's sort of business as usual. But I don't know what's going to happen this time. I really don't.
No, I mean, firstly, there's one school of thought where we say, well, does it matter? What would actually be the impact of getting rid of the non-dom regime? Okay, so now we have the statutory residence test. Okay, so for a lot of people, it is now much easier for them to be non-UK residents, even though they spend time in the UK. So historically, UK tax residence was decided by some very vague principles. And for a lot of people, it was difficult for them to be clear whether or not they were UK resident or not. So it was for people who did want to have a home in the UK and spend a certain amount of time in the UK, then to err on the side of caution, they were probably UK tax residents. Now, with the statutory residence test, there are clearer rules, much clearer rules, to determine whether you are, whereby which you can say, okay, if you spent fewer than a certain number of days in the UK, then you're definitely not resident in the UK. If you spent more than a certain number of days in the UK, then you definitely are resident in the UK. There are some then cases in between where there can still be element of complication or lack of clarity or ambiguity. But if I'm a globally mobile, wealthy individual who, yes, has my pied-à-terre in London or my hunting estate in the English countryside, Scotland or wherever, and I like to spend 2 to 3 months a year in the UK, I can do that, and I can be very certain that I am not UK resident. And then, regardless of the non-dom regime, I'm not going to be paying any UK tax, subject to certain economic activity that I might carry on in the UK, where even if you're non-resident, you pay UK tax. Yeah. But that might, for a lot of people, and I suspect that's what's happened over the last few years, is that a lot of these wealthy foreigners who are perceived as living in the UK probably aren't tax residents in the UK. They spend time in their home country, they spend time in the south of France, they spend time somewhere where it's warmer in the winter.
You're quite right, because the statutory residence test, once it was codified, is fantastic, isn't it? Because I work with clients who were asking, okay, what's the minimum amount of days I need to be in the UK for me to be tax resident there? And then obviously the other side of the coin is, or what's the minimum that I have to be out, what's the maximum I have to be outside the UK to not be tax resident there? And you can calculate both of those equations perfectly, right? So I think you, as a good point, since they codified it, it's crystal clear, and clients are very good at tracking their days now, and making sure that they don't do any business on the phone when they're in the UK and that sort of thing, right? And they're quite wise to those rules now and their application, and not falling foul of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, even if you are a UK tax resident, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to pay a huge amount of UK tax or any UK tax. So one example would be if you remain resident in another country, then the double tax treaty between the UK and that country may effectively shelter your non-UK income and gains from UK tax. And yes, it probably means you have to pay tax in that other country where you're living, but how much that tax will be, or is open. It will depend on which jurisdiction it is. So, if people are dual residents and can rely on double tax treaties, even if the non-dom regime is got rid of entirely, the UK could still be perfectly palatable from a tax point of view. Another case would be UK residents who don't actually own much or earn much themselves, but they rely on the wealth of family members or family trusts outside the UK. So if you're the sort of next gen of a wealthy family and you come and live in the UK, you might be receiving gifts from your parents. You might be receiving distributions from family trusts or other structures. And again, there may be limits on how much UK tax you have to pay.
I think the gift tax, well, there is no gift tax, is it? The concept of gift tax is under the inheritance tax regulations, isn't it? So if a foreigner is gifting to a UK resident, I think there would be no tax, would there? So as you say, if there's somebody there who wants to contribute and just to the economy and build a business using what's in the UK, they can be funded tax-free from family members, and that's got nothing to do with the non-dom regime.
Yeah, exactly. If you've got sort of the bank of mum and dad outside the UK, and they're minded to pay for your lifestyle, then there would be no tax in the UK.
It used to be the Russian mother-in-law. Do you remember that? I used to always see that one. The Russian mother-in-law, for some reason, always had a lot of money.
Yeah, and also just I think culturally, in a lot of other places around the world, family wealth is held collectively or by certain senior family members, and they are effectively acting as a trustee or custodian of that wealth for the wider family. But everyone participates in it to some degree, and that's accidentally quite effective UK tax planning.
Right.
The family members becomes residents in the UK.
Yeah. That trustworthy family member is always useful, isn't it? The overseas trustworthy family member. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, and then another thing would be, like even if they sort of get rid of non-dom regime in its entirety, if you're a non-dom who you've got that your stockpile of clean capital outside the UK, well, going forward, unless they introduced a charge on bringing any money to the UK, which that would, it'd be extraordinary if they did that, then you can live as a non-dom in the UK, and you can bring in your savings as and when you need them. And yes, you'll have to pay tax on interest and dividends and so on those savings outside the UK. But well, that's not always very much money. Often people are quite conservative with their investment strategy as well. So they've got to a stage in life where they've got a few million in the bank. They're not investing it adventurously or aggressively, and they can sit in the UK and live off that money, paying very little tax. So those individuals will not be very affected by it. Also, there are products like offshore insurance bonds, which have nothing to do with the non-dom regime, but are a wrapper where funds can roll up tax-free, and you can take a certain amount of money out of those bonds each year, whether you're a non-dom or a UK domicile person, and not pay tax on that. So
yeah, because that's a good point. A lot of people say that, look, I just want to be in the UK because while my grandchildren are growing up, my daughter lives there. She married a Brit. I want to be there for 5 years. Can I collect my money when I leave? And so a lot of people actually kind of ask for, how can I roll my potentially taxable gains up offshore because I know I'm not going to be there. So yeah, I guess that something like that would be quite useful, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So I think my sort of summary of my view on what's happening in non-dom is that even if there are changes, it may be that as has always been the case, they are watered down, there's compromises, there's fudges, they're not as dramatic as they could be. In an ideal world, I would like to see the UK actually just take a root and branch approach to modernising the way in which it taxes international wealth and new arrivals, but I think that's probably not going to happen. But then in a perceived worst case scenario where they do just abolish the whole of the non-dom regime, I think there's a very limited, and it's quite an elite club of individuals who would be drastically affected by a complete abolition of the non-dom regime. I think for many people moving to the UK, it would make little or no difference. Many people already living in the UK, there'll be ways in which the blow will be softened so it doesn't ruin their life overnight. So I think, and I strongly suspect that those people who would be quite drastically affected by it, there will be, as you say, some back doors or compromises in the way the changes come in, that those people are and their wealth is protected from it to some extent.
Yeah,
so.
I agree with that. I'd be very surprised if they got rid of it entirely. And I think it will be some watering down. Maybe we can talk about the election now, actually, and our conversation on that will explain why we think these things.